Hello again to you all, and welcome as Leto Lectures presents another lecture in our series, The Presidency 2020, taking our way down to November the 3rd, when we will go and vote to elect the President of the United States. As we all know, on the Tuesday following the first Monday in November, every 4 years, federal law requires that Americans vote to elect a president. But we also know that there are other important offices that will be on ballots all across the state on that same day. For instance, this November, the 33 Senate seats that represent the so-called Class 2 Senate seats will be on the ballot in states who possess Class 2 Senate seats, 33 of them, as well as 2 special senatorial elections, one to fill the vacancy created with the death of John McCain in Arizona, the other to fill a vacancy created by the retirement of Senator Johnny Isakson in Georgia. So in total, there will be 35 Senate seats on the ballot, 23 of which are now held by Republicans, who are going to seek to maintain control of those seats as a means of continuing to maintain their control of the United States Senate itself. Currently, the Senate is split. 53 Republicans constitute the Senate majority, while the Democrats in the minority hold 47. Come the results of the presidential election, if President Trump were reelected, Democrats would need to win a net of 4 additional Senate seats to have 51 to control the Senate that will be sworn in when the new Congress is sworn in next January. If, however, Joe Biden, now the presumptive Democratic nominee, were to win the presidency, the Democrats would need to win just a net of 3 seats, because in an environment of a 50-50 tie, Biden's vice president, the president of the Senate, will cast any tie-breaking votes, therefore giving the majority of the Senate in a tied environment to the Democratic Party. There are a number of very interesting Senate races that we're watching now and that we're certainly going to talk a lot about as we get closer to Election Day. Some of those that you should keep in mind if you like these things and watch for concern senators like Susan Collins, perhaps the most moderate of the Republicans in the Senate. Collins is locked into what the polls tell us is a very tight race to retain her seat in Maine. In Colorado, Republican Cory Gardner is going to face off against John Hickenlooper. He was, I think, a candidate for the Democratic nomination sometime last year, seems like for about 10 or 15 minutes. But in the state of Colorado, Hickenlooper, a former mayor of Denver, a former governor of the state of Colorado, is thought to be a very formidable challenger to the incumbent Senator Cory Gardner. We're watching in North Carolina. North Carolina now one of these very pivotal swing states. First-term Republican Senator Tom Tillis in a very close race against a Democrat from North Carolina, a longtime political player there by the name of Cal Cunningham. Arizona, Martha McSally, who is serving out the rest of Senator John McCain's term, is facing off against a former astronaut, Mark Kelly, who is married to Gabby Giffords, a former House member from Arizona who you recall was the victim of a horrific shooting several years ago. Some polls show Mark Kelly enjoying a double-digit lead over Martha McSally as we stand here today. Other Republican-held seats that are going to be of interest include that of Senator Steve Daines from the state of Montana, who has drawn as his challenger the very popular Montana Governor Steve Bullock in a race that, again, is probably going to be a lot closer than the presidential outcome. Montana, a state that voted overwhelmingly for President Trump 4 years ago and tends to vote in presidential races for the Republican nominee, notwithstanding the fact that Montana's other senator is now in his third term, John Tester, a Democrat, and again, Steve Daines and Steve Bullock probably are going to be locked into a very tight race. Joni Ernst, the senator from Iowa, is locked in a race that has become closer in the last few months. And the two seats that will be on the ballot from Georgia, again, the race to replace Johnny Isakson, Kelly Loeffler is the current placeholder there, thought to be in a very tough primary race, and again, perhaps a tough general election race as well. And the incumbent Republican, Sonny Perdue, in a state, Georgia, that, like many Sun Belt states, has become demographically closer, meaning that the Democrats hope to score higher and higher numbers of vote counts in these states that are becoming, again, more and more competitive. On the Democratic side, one seat that I would say is probably the most endangered of every Senate seat on the ballot, and that is the Democrat Doug Jones, who 2 years ago, in a big surprise, won the Senate seat that had been left behind when Jeff Sessions resigned to become President Trump's first Attorney General. Doug Jones not only is a Democrat running in a bright red Republican state like Alabama, Doug Jones is also running against, in all probability, Tommy Tuberville, the very well-known former football coach at the University of Auburn University, located, of course, in the state of Alabama. In the House of Representatives, in theory, all 435 seats will be on the ballot. In reality, only a few of those seats will change control from one party to another. The Democrats currently enjoy about a 40-seat advantage over the Republicans. They are the majority party in the House. If the Republicans manage to turn about 21 of these seats, they will return to the majority in the House as well. So it's fair to say that control of Congress is another important subtext to, of course, what at the top of the ticket is the marquee race, that for president. And it's always interesting to see how well the Democrat and the Republican presidential candidate does because of the so-called coattail effect that could carry members of their party over the line to victory if the candidate at the top of the ticket happens to do particularly well. On top of this, we know that throughout the country, there are races for governorships and other state and local races that are going to make 2020 a very interesting year. The party that controls the governorship and the legislature of the various states will have a very big voice in the redistricting that is going to begin to take place next year in 2021 once the results of this year's census are reported. Now, as we stand here today, we can say, as I stated earlier, that Joe Biden clearly and certainly is the presumptive, the next nominee of the Democratic Party for the race for president. Since we've last met, a number of states have held primaries, most of which had been canceled earlier during the COVID-19 challenges. They've now voted and have now given former Vice President Biden enough delegates in hand to be a locked, surefire next nominee of the Democratic Party. We've seen in these more recent sets of votes large numbers of voters utilizing absentee ballots, some voting by mail. In those races where voters turned out at polls, we saw these surreal sights of long lines of people wearing masks, standing 6 feet apart, in some cases waiting for hours to get to a chance to cast a vote at their precinct. Logic tells us that as we make our way to November, states that offer citizens opportunities to vote via mail, to vote via absentee ballot, are going to see lots and lots of voters choose to vote in that fashion as an alternative to standing in line, wearing a mask, socially distancing. We've seen, of course, a political issue arise where the president and the Republican Party are pointing out and are alleging that mail-in voting and absentee voting is an invitation for fraud, an invitation for vote manipulation, even though the president, who is now a Florida resident, voted most recently in Florida elections through the mail himself. So something that remains to be seen, but Joe Biden is in. And when we talk in a bit about what we anticipate the party conventions to do, we'll delve a little more into the mechanics of how the parties are going to renominate President Trump, nominate Joe Biden, and how they're going to try to conduct as normal a convention as possible in this new age in which we live, in this age of the coronavirus of COVID-19. Now, had we not had, again, this event, this coming of the coronavirus, so disrupt what would have normally been already a pretty vibrant presidential election cycle, had we not seen the coronavirus overshadowed in the last month or so by the circumstances surrounding the killing of George Floyd and all of the protests for greater racial equality enter the picture, those of you that have been attending our lectures for a while, those of you that have been attending our lectures for more than a dozen years, as we've been presenting them on a regular basis, would know that we would also talk about other important things that are occurring, not directly associated perhaps with our topic, at the beginning of all of our lectures. So we would be remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time remembering and recognizing what was happening around the world 75 years ago. As in 1945, the Second World War was mercifully and finally coming to an end, both in Europe and then later, of course, in the Pacific. So 75 years ago, 1945, began as a year where on January the 20th, President Franklin Roosevelt, sicker, frailer, was sworn in, inaugurated for his record 4th term as president on January the 20th, 1945, along with his brand new vice president, the former Missouri Senator Harry Truman. Less than 3 months later, on April 12th, President Roosevelt died while at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. And on that day, April 12, 1945, Harry Truman took the oath of President of the United States, becoming America's 33rd president. Even though during his time as vice president, Harry Truman had sat down and met with President Roosevelt just one time in which nothing of any particular substance was discussed between them. So April 12th, a sad day in American history. I talked to my father. I used to talk to my uncles, and dates that they remember, December 7th, 1941, November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy's assassination. Young people, of course, remember 9/11 as an important day in their lives. April 12th, 1945 was similarly one of these mournful days because it marked the death of a man who had been President of the United States for more than a dozen years by the time he passed. Harry Truman takes office, things begin happening very quickly. History sometimes is very cruel, and just less than a month of President Roosevelt's passing, on May the 8th, Germany, battered, beaten, invaded, the Soviets coming from the east, the Americans and the British and the French coming from the west, bring about on May the 8th, 1945, the surrender of Germany. VE Day, one huge sigh of relief. The fighting in the European theater has come to an end, and soon American troops, earning points for the amount of action they'd seen, begin to return home to their spouses, to children, sometimes children whom they've never seen, to parents. And again, the winding down of the war begins. In June, or by June, President Truman would be fully brought up to speed to the nature of the Manhattan Project, something that prior to taking the oath of office of president, Truman didn't know much about specifically and knew just very generally about this top secret project that had been underway. By June, the output of a huge uranium processing facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, of a huge plutonium processing facility along the Hanford River in Washington State, and of course, the design and engineering of the devices that would permit these two radioactive atomic chemicals to detonate at Los Alamos in New Mexico, had produced devices fueled by two different fuels, uranium and plutonium, that were soon going to be available to perhaps accelerate the end of the war in the Pacific. So by July of 1945, President Truman is off to Potsdam in occupied Germany to hold meetings with, among others, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. The purpose of these meetings were, number one, to discuss the occupation post-war of Germany, to talk about how denazification was going to be accomplished, and to discuss if there were ever going to be tribunals, trials, where purported alleged Nazi war victims would be held, war criminals would be held accountable for their actions. President Truman had another reason in traveling to Potsdam, and that was to persuade Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan, something that the Soviet Union had not done at this very late date, July 1945. Until then, the Soviet Union's only adversary was Germany, who of course had violated a non-aggression treaty and had invaded the Soviet Union back in January of 1941 in the infamous Operation Barbarossa. So in the summer of 1945, at a time when many American military planners believed that the only way the Japanese could be defeated, was by an invasion, occupation, and absolute devastation of the Japanese people, many believed that the war still had a year and a half to go, and who knows how many more hundreds of thousands of deaths and casualties. So the commitment that the Soviet Union would take part in this defeat of the Japanese, again, caused the president to urge Stalin on behalf of his country to declare war on Japan. Now, while President Truman was at Potsdam, he received great news. News regarding the first test of a nuclear device that had been undertaken at a place called Alamogordo in New Mexico. The test, known as the Trinity test, was one of a plutonium-fueled device. Don't ask me why, but the scientists at Los Alamos were very certain that the uranium-fueled device, the one that came to be known as Little Boy, was going to be triggered and was going to detonate when it was set to be detonated, but they weren't so sure about the plutonium device. The one that came to be known as Fat Man would detonate based on a theory known as an implosion of a small nuclear core, 14 pounds, in fact, of plutonium that would have to detonate again when desired. And the Trinity test at Alamogordo showed, in fact, that that could occur and would occur. So the first fireball, the first mushroom cloud, the signature of an atomic reaction, of an atomic explosion, was recorded then at Alamogordo, and President Truman received word while in the meeting, in the middle of these meetings in Potsdam. Harry Truman would later talk a lot about his time in office as president. He dictated, in fact, an oral autobiography to an author named Merle Miller called Plain Speaking, a great read if you haven't read it. Merle Miller would talk about how in a lot of cases, President Truman would sit in the library of the Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri, maybe with a tumbler of bourbon in a glass by him, and become real candid and wide open about his experiences as president. And Truman tells the story of when he'd received word about what had happened at Alamogordo, he tried in the most clever, oblique, indirect way that he thought possible to let Stalin know that we had something that might actually be a great game changer regarding the defeat of the Japanese, hoping that the Soviets would then more easily declare war against Japan. Truman, of course, later found out that when he was making those statements, Stalin had known about the Manhattan Project longer than he, Truman, and had known much more about the details of the devices that were being built because, of course, of espionage that was taking place on behalf of the Soviets at the time. President Truman said he'd never felt like a bigger damn fool trying to cajole Stalin and suggest we had a way to end the war more quickly. So even before the president returned home from Potsdam, he'd already given orders to military commanders way out in the Pacific near Japan, where nuclear devices, one a plutonium-based one a uranium-based one, had pre-positioned for these commanders to select the targets and use the devices against the cities that would most quickly cause the Japanese to surrender. And so we know on August the 6th, 1945, A B-25 by the name of the Enola Gay delivered the uranium-based device known as Little Boy over the city of Hiroshima in Japan. We know that 3 days later, no word of surrender forthcoming from the Japanese, a B-25 called Boxcar delivered the plutonium device, Fat Man, over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Both detonated, both caused, again, tremendous loss of life, tremendous releases of radiation, and then 5 days later, August 14th, Japan surrendered. VJ Day was celebrated. The war had come to an end in both continents. Lots of GIs, two of my uncles, probably many that you know, who had fought in Europe, returned home, and were now making their way towards California. Some to the Pacific to take part in another war, were told you could turn around. The war was over. On September the 2nd, 1945, the war officially came to an end when the Japanese government formally surrendered in a ceremony taking place on the deck of the USS Missouri, docked in Tokyo Bay. 75 years ago, during June, during July, during August, the war was coming to an end. Many of you took part in that conflict. God bless you and thank you. And great good fortune for having lived so long. But just about all of you had someone there. And remember the bizarre, difficult, challenging times that the Second World War brought to the United States. So I think it's worth taking some time to remember again, 75 years ago, that conflict came to an end. Now, back to the race for president. We are about 4 months away from Election Day, and it's fair to say that in the last 4 months, events have taken place that have very much thrown out of whack the best laid plans of the incumbent President Trump seeking re-election, and has probably altered the narrative that Joe Biden, who is now the Democratic nominee, was going to try to make as we made our way towards the race. You remember that early this year, probably more than once, several times, I made a statement regarding a reality of recent American presidential politics, and that is, it is very difficult to defeat an incumbent American president. There are advantages that come with incumbency. The ability to raise all the money you need to fund your re-election campaign. The prestige of the office. You are the commander-in-chief of the American military. You're often regarded as the leader of the free world. The use of Air Force One to make your way on official business, but campaign business as well. Every time you appear in public, you speak behind a podium where the seal of the office of the President of the United States is displayed. And certainly, incumbent American presidents, in particular Donald Trump, have no problems generating news coverage, good, bad, or indifferent. Everyone wants to hear what the president has to say. Ultimately, an incumbent president likes to ask the electorate, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? How are things going now compared to when I was elected and made all of the promises that I did? Have I honored them? Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And up until even mid-March, 3, 4 months ago. We were witnessing in the United States record low unemployment. Just about everyone who wanted a job could find a job. And equally importantly, real wage growth relative to the cost of living, something that lots of American workers hadn't seen in a very long time. Interest rates were extraordinarily low. You wanted to buy a house, you could probably afford to acquire one. Record numbers of employment for African Americans, for Hispanic Americans, and again, wage growth as well. The stock market, every few weeks, was seemingly reaching record numbers at the Dow, the NASDAQ, the S&P. We saw a renegotiated NAFTA. Lots of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, certainly those who had lost well-paying manufacturing jobs, saw NAFTA as one of the culprits, sweetheart deals that permitted American manufacturers to ship jobs to China or to Mexico. President Trump renegotiated NAFTA and promised that the United States, Canada, Mexico agreement was going to give a better shake to American workers. Jobs were going to return to our shores. Back in February, President Trump announced that one of the many significant issues the United States has with China, and if you recall in lectures we've presented in the past, there is no greater challenge that the United States must confront, take on, and win than the China challenge. It is a challenge of economics. It is a challenge of international relations. It is a military challenge. It is a challenge regarding free markets, the protection of trade secrets, the theft of intellectual property that we as a country must deal successfully with China. And the president announced that a trade deal had been reached. And soon China was going to be purchasing lots of stuff, particularly stuff from American ranchers and American farmers. It looked like maybe things were going to reach some fruition vis-a-vis China. Little rocket man, Kim Jong-un, that impetuous third generation leader of North Korea, wasn't making a lot of noise. He wasn't testing medium range or intercontinental ballistic missiles. He wasn't detonating nuclear devices in underground tests. He even disappeared for a few weeks, laying low. And again, the president claimed that it was the diplomacy that he initiated with Kim Jong-un that has caused this. And finally, in the Middle East, President Trump could claim that we have identified and isolated Iran as not just the greatest threat to countries in the region, but our greatest geopolitical adversary in the greater Middle East as well. He claimed, President Trump did, to have solidified an alliance with the Gulf Sunni Arab oil-producing countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, et al., and at the same time has brought into this unwieldy alliance Israel, and in particular, having formed a strong relationship with the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu. Sure, the president sometimes at times was unconventional. Sometimes he acted as a disruptor, acted chaotically. Sometimes he was a bit profane. Sometimes he stretched the truth a little bit, sometimes more than a little bit. And of course, sometimes he pushed the rules and pushed the envelope. But again, by mid-March, the case was made that in the matter and the issue that usually drives elections, domestic economics, the picture was quite rosy. And in polling taken all the way into March, Donald Trump was polling at the same level, and in some cases even a little better than he'd been polling 4 years ago when he narrowly defeated Hillary Clinton to become the 44th president of the United States, 45th president of the United States, with all due respect to President Obama, who was 44. Then January, February, March. If you're following the news, you suddenly start hearing this word coronavirus. You hear, if you delve a little more deeply, that this was the virus similar to that which had caused MERS and SARS, epidemics that had struck the world in the last 10 to 15 years. You suddenly became familiar with what is really a large but largely unknown city in China called Wuhan, and how people there were seemingly getting sick. And the Chinese government was very rapidly building enormous hospitals to deal with the effects of this virus, which tended to be respiratory in nature. You watched as death and chaos from China made its way into Europe. And suddenly, horrific cases, vast numbers of cases in Italy, in Spain, in Britain, in France, again of this unknown disease, an epidemic soon to be described by the World Health Organization as a pandemic. And the record shows that during this period of time, notwithstanding what the Center for Disease Control, not what the Center for Infectious Diseases were saying regarding not if, but what's going to happen when this virus makes it to the United States. The president, again, was at his most optimistic. Just 10 or 15 people had it, and they soon will be cured. We stopped flights coming from China. We've dealt with that problem. There's going to be a miracle, and one day we're going to wake up and it disappears. Except, of course, it didn't. And by mid-March, March 13th, 14th, 15th, the president addresses the country and talks about the dangers now of this disease that had been given by then a formal name, COVID-19. All of a sudden, state by state by state, people are ordered to stay at home. Businesses shut down. Schools shut down. Our little monthly gatherings coming to an end as far as live presentations. Older folks judged to be particularly vulnerable by this disease, quarantined, locked down, begged to stay home. Restaurants closing, sports teams and leagues shutting down. The NBA shut down its season. The NHL shut down its season. Major League Baseball canceled the rest of spring training. Will there be a regular season? Remains to be seen. Theaters closed, Broadway closed, the New York Opera shut down. And as a consequence of this systemic disruption to the American way of life, I suspect more disruptive to Americans living in the United States than all of the rationing and all of the worry and all of the sacrifices that we as a country made 75 years ago to win the Second World War. Domestically in the United States, I suspect that this has been a more disruptive period to those who lived through those earlier times that we are experiencing right now. And what happened? Number one, millions of jobs suddenly lost. Somewhere around 40 million people over this time lost their jobs, about a quarter of the American workforce. The airline industry grinds to a halt. Airports recognizing at the worst 95% drop in traffic. Hotel industry closed down. Nobody wants to go to a hotel. Venerable, profitable firms like Boeing brought to its knees because all of a sudden there were no delivery of new aircraft to the airlines around the world that had purchased them. The stock market cratered, losing 10,000 points over the span of just a couple of weeks. The oil market cratered when a huge supply of oil with a very low demand brought oil prices in some cases to less than $10 a barrel, endangering big oil companies and small American oil concerns. All of the fracking companies, all of the shale companies, again, very much in danger because of this collapse. Americans having to become familiar with new vernacular, social distancing, don't go out without your mask, touch elbows, don't shake hands. And of course, this response by the federal government, the infusion of trillions of dollars to keep the economy afloat, to help pay workers who couldn't go to work. In the span of several months, this occurred. And now, as we stand here today, more than 110,000 Americans have lost their lives to COVID-19. And we've seen now 2 million cases on our shores. And again, as these effects became known, as we saw every day with a lot of time on our hands and probably watched way too much news, we would see the daily briefings of the coronavirus task force and would see the president frequently, become the star of these programs. And we would see tension arise between the president on behalf of the federal government and individual state governors and mayors. The president at times claiming that he had, the overall power to do anything he wanted regarding what states were doing to deal with this crisis. But then on some days, basically saying this wasn't a federal matter. It was up to the individual states and mayors to get your own ventilators, get your own masks. This is a state problem, not a federal problem. Tension, and in some cases, great inconsistencies. Growing tension and hostility between representatives of the United States government and the Chinese government. For a while, we were calling this the Chinese flu, the Wuhan flu. And all of a sudden, we look at perhaps another type of Cold War evolving out of the bad feelings regarding how promptly China advised the rest of the world of the severity of this ailment. Then there was tension between different factions of Americans in the states wanting to open up the economies again. Was it safe to do so? Was it better to wait? The president eventually taking sides, liberate Michigan, liberate Pennsylvania, open these places up. Citizens, upstanding citizens, living in states with very liberal open carry law were suddenly showing up in state capitals with firepower, pistols, the AK-47 replica guns, and again, this right to protest, armed, trying again to accelerate the opening up of the economy. People were desperate and wanted to go to work. Conflict between the president, who had to run for re-election in November, The economy is sinking. That, again, was large part of his foundation, having to deal with medical experts. I suspect if you let medical experts run things, in a lot of their minds, we'd still be locked down. That's their perspective. The president hearing voices from business, voices from average citizens, having to balance all of these interests and trying to keep people safe, but of course not let the cure be worse than the disease itself. A lot of that was, again, very, very sensible, the way it was put. And again, these daily briefings, the president eventually opining that, maybe drinking chlorine or some disinfectant might rid a person of the disease. And of course, you know what happens. Some damn fool somewhere goes out and drinks bleach and dies because he'd heard someone say so on TV. So what happened? This impending presidential election, the convention season in the summer, suddenly became an afterthought, if it was mentioned at all. Reopening began, some in April, more in May. Most places are now in various stages of reopening. Thank God, people are being hired again. They're going work to work again. The economy has resuscitated itself. The stock market has recovered. Restaurants are opening. Stores are opening. Great news. Then, May 25th, a little more than a month ago as you're watching this, everyone sees the video of George Floyd, a man in custody by the police for suspicion of having passed a counterfeit $20 bill in a store. He's handcuffed, and for 8 or 9 excruciating minutes, hard video to watch, a police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck kills him, the cause of death being ruled asphyxiation. And all of a sudden, of course, maybe because lots of people are home, lots of people have idle time on their hands, lots of people are antsy and ready to do something. On top, of course, the legitimate issues regarding excessive police violence against minorities leads to mass rallies taking place all around the country. Many of them peaceful, many of them led by groups like Black Lives Matter, pointing out again the different treatment, it appears, that minorities, non-whites, have in interactions with police compared with people of color. So the protests become more numerous. As often occurs when protests carry out late into the night, opportunists emerge, and all of a sudden looting and burning, the assault to police officers, the assault to police departments ensue, all playing out on TV. Suddenly, COVID-19 is swept to the side, and this becomes the predominant issue now for several weeks within the United States. The president, having won 4 years ago on a law and order platform, encourages governors and mayors to dominate these protesters, break up these gatherings, arrest fringe groups that he alleges being behind these activities. Dominate was the word. So, June the 1st, a large crowd had gathered in Lafayette Park, which of course is located adjacent to the White House, the northern part of the White House, I believe. And all of a sudden, federalized officers from Border Patrol, from Customs Enforcement, from ICE, break up a gathering that by all accounts was a peaceful gathering using rubber bullets, using some type of an irritant, tear gas, some type of other type of irritant, breaks out this crowd, breaks up this gathering, a phalanx of officers lined up so that the president can walk from the White House to survey a church located adjacent to the White House. It's been known as the Church of Presidents, that had had a fire set in its basement. The president walks over, looks at the church, picks up a Bible, and takes a picture outside of the church with this Bible in hand. Some say it was a show of force. Some say it was an attempt to vindicate and protect places of worship. Some say it was a photo op, again, using this massive firepower to do it. At the same time, we've seen calls like we have in the past to deal with a vestige of our history that 160 years or so on, following the beginning of the Civil War, still creates in our country a great amount of angst, a great amount of rancor, and in the eyes of many, still a very unequal environment regarding race relations in the United States. So all of a sudden, we see on Monument Avenue in Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, with these huge, imposing, lit statues of Robert E. Lee, of Jeb Stuart, of General Pickett, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, defaced, calls being made to take them down. Jefferson Davis's statue was in fact pulled down from its perch on Monument Avenue recently. And in many other cities, the same pronouncements were made. Coming from the Army, coming from protesters, coming from Congress, calls to rename American military installations that were named after former officers in the Confederate military. Men who, by some definitions, in waging war against the United States, had committed treason, were nonetheless the beneficiaries of these beautiful bases being named, these large bases in their honor. So calls to change the name of Fort Bragg, named after Confederate General Braxton Bragg, Fort Benning, Henry Benning, Camp Beauregard, Camp Hill, Camp Hood, Camp Lee, named after Robert E. Lee. Congress recently, in a committee and a voice vote, the Senate, Republican-controlled Senate, approved a rider on a defense bill that would mandate the changing of the names of these bases. The president has promised to veto if this bill reaches his desk. So just like COVID and the administration's response to it, Americans now, I suspect, are sitting back and digesting how the administration is responding to the broad issue, I think, of police violence against minorities, but also how the administration has responded, in some cases, to people that were exercising their First Amendment right to gather and petition the government for redress of grievances. Just like all those folks in Lansing, Michigan, and other state capitals gathered with firearms to protest the government and being closed down, so too were these individuals in many cities gathering again for other purposes. So we're watching and gathering. And meanwhile, former President Joe Biden has disappeared into his basement, literally in his basement, in his home in Wilmington, Delaware, abiding by stay-at-home orders that the governor of Delaware issued. Joe Biden has tweeted. Joe Biden has done some interviews through some crude forms of photographing. But, he's at home, laying low while all of these acts are playing out. He may be addled, he may be sleepy, all the different names that are given to him. But is he also engaging in a pretty smart strategy? Maybe a little bit of both. Maybe he is sleepy and maybe he is a little addled, but maybe this strategy is also a good one to just stay out of this picture. Now, so in a few months, the complexion of the race has changed. And all elections, when there is an incumbent, is ultimately a referendum on how well the incumbent has done. Incumbents often are able to make the election sometimes about their opponent. But this clearly has become an election that, unless something really remarkable happens in the next 4 months, I suspect most voters are going to determine whom they're going to vote for based on how they perceive President Trump has acted, not just in these last few months, but maybe primarily these last few months, and of course throughout his time in office. So we look to polls and the science/art of polling to sometimes give us insight and give us guidance as to how certain races are coming along. Bear in mind that one single poll is nothing more than a snapshot of how a sampling of an electorate feels about a particular race. And bear in mind that every poll is only as good as the model that those conducting the poll has built to collect what they believe is the most representative sample of the electorate, whose results might then be extrapolated to suggest the state of a particular race. So we know that pollsters use a lot of variables to try to create this ideal sampling of voters whom they are going to ask questions of. Some of the variables, of course, include political party affiliation. Pollsters try to build an electorate, normally 40% maybe Democrat, 35% Republican, 25% independent. Lots of Americans identify as independent, or some combination of those three factors. Race, you need to have a representative sampling of the electorate you anticipate to turn out: white, African American, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, and so on. People of different ages turn out in different percentages, and a well-built model will show the reality that older Americans tend to vote much more reliably than do younger Americans, and accommodations have to be made for that reality. People of different income, people who are religious or not religious, sometimes vote with various degrees of reliability. The great rural-urban divide in the United States, people living in cities oftentimes are demographically different and thus vote differently than those folks who live in rural areas. How do you find a proper balance to try to make that poll more accurate and more predictive? For a long time, when polls were taken via telephone, landlines were the only ones used to gather data. Now, of course, so many people don't have landlines, so pollsters have had to find a way to sample those with cellular phones in order to have more accurate results. And over the past several months, we've seen the polls shift against President Trump and in favor of Joe Biden, both in hypothetical nationwide matchups. We don't elect our president that way. But over time, Joe Biden's lead in these head-to-head matchups is now approaching double digits, 10%. And we've seen the presidential approval numbers. Every reputable polling entity asks people, how do you feel about the job the president's doing? And again, those that find his performance unfavorable now surpass favorables by double digits. Now, I know a lot of you like to do these things. I'm going to suggest two websites to look at. I'm going to put it on the handout as well. One is 538.com. That's the total number of electoral votes up for grabs on November the 3rd. A lot more about the Electoral College later. And the other is realclearpolitics.com. Both of these sites aggregate, they collect the data from polls taken that they consider to have statistically reliable polling models and give you an opportunity to see how over time the aggregation and the averaging of poll results change. And again, it's instructive to see at any particular time how the state of a race may be turning out. Now, of course, on November the 3rd, we're not going to add up all the votes cast nationwide and give the presidency to the winner of the national popular vote. It's more accurate to say that when we vote on November the 3rd, what are actually taking place are 51 separate winner-take-all elections, with two examples, Nebraska and Maine, and later we'll talk about how they award their electoral votes. But the general rule, the candidate who wins the most votes in a state by a lot or just by a little wins all of that state's predetermined number of electoral votes. So it's more fascinating sometimes to watch the state polling data. We know, of course, that there are the battleground states that have been that way for 5 or 6 cycles. Florida, Ohio, North Carolina, Virginia, New Hampshire, Colorado, Iowa. Some that recently have become battleground states. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan were states that had voted for the Democratic nominee in every presidential election since 1992. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin had not voted for a Republican candidate, in other words, since 1988, but President Trump won all 3 of those states and every one of their electoral votes by about 180,000 total votes out of 14 million cast in those 3 states. And that is what put him over the top to make him president. They are firmly in play once again in 2020. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, as to one degree or another, are going to be Minnesota, Arizona, New Mexico, maybe Georgia, and yes, the polling suggests that Texas is more in play at this stage of the race in 2020 than it has been in the last 10 presidential election cycles. I'm not predicting Texas is going to go blue, but I think we're going to see this being reflective of the great demographic changes that are taking place in the Lone Star State. And we'll talk about that in one of our lectures down the line. And again, the polls show that former Vice President Biden is running very well in every one of these battleground states. And in recent polls coming out of Texas and Georgia, the president and Joe Biden are within the margin of error regarding the poll, meaning that they are running very closely. Now, we looked at polls in 2016, 4 years ago, and the polls predicted Hillary Clinton, most of them, was going to win the presidency, but a lot of the polls did in fact predict that the margin of her popular vote victory was going to be a very close one. She won by a little more than 2% of the popular vote. The election 4 years ago was notable because both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were found in polls to be viewed more unfavorably than favorably. So when voters were asked if they had a favorable view or an unfavorable view of both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, they were both found to be more unfavorable than favorable in this aggregation of polling data. Those voters that turned out to vote on election day that didn't like either candidate have since been described as, quote, double haters. And when the results of votes cast by double haters were polled, it turns out that Donald Trump by election day had won more than 70% of voters who basically said, I don't like her, I don't like him, but I like him more than I like her. So again, maybe demonizing his adversary, attacking Hillary Clinton more than she attacked him, was a big factor in this race. Now, we look today, and like just about any recent incumbent, again, Donald Trump is underwater. More voters view him unfavorably than favorably. But Joe Biden is nowhere near Hillary Clinton regarding the unfavorability factor with voters who are polled. Maybe it's the case that Joe Biden is, he may be old, he may be gaffe prone, he may be doddering, he may be sleepy, senile Joe. But lots of people also view Joe Biden as warm, as empathetic, and as real. His life has had notable tragedies, which he talks about very frequently on the trail. So the Trump campaign these days is really working hard to raise that unlikability factor regarding Joe Biden. And I suspect if the COVID had not intervened, had the George Floyd matter and the response to it had not taken place, they'd have been much further along in trying to somehow paint Joe Biden as someone who, as vice president, used the office to perhaps cause officials in Ukraine to meddle in the American election. We're going to hear a lot about that. We know the allegations, of course, that Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, personally profited by becoming a board member of a gas company with business in Ukraine called Burisma. We're going to hear that Joe Biden had some culpability in the unmasking of Lieutenant General Michael Flynn and others who were investigated by the FBI in the latter days of the campaign. Trump people are already referring to Joe Biden as Beijing Biden, trying to tie him to China, a country that has seen its likability among Americans really drop precipitously. Beijing Biden is going to be described as someone whose family members might have profited through some interest in China, and Biden gave away the store as one of President Obama's point people in creating all these issues with China that President Trump is now attempting to take on. So again, you raise Biden's unfavorabilities, and then you have the president hoping to make the case that with all of these unfavorable attributes of Joe Biden, it's better to vote instead to re-elect Donald Trump, who is very much presenting himself as the outsider, even though he's been president for 4 years, still talking about a swamp that needs to be cleaned, vis-a-vis Senator Biden, or former Vice President Biden, who first entered the United States Senate in January of 1973. 47 years ago. Now, so what do major party conventions accomplish? Once upon a time, these were places, of course, where reliable party members from all around the country gathered, usually in a big city, Chicago, St. Louis, New York, stayed in hotels, gathered in these large, hot auditoriums and waited for a small number of party bigwigs, men in smoke-filled rooms, to determine among themselves in most cases who the nominee was going to be. The word filtered down to the loyal delegates. You wouldn't be a delegate unless you were loyal. And the decision of the men in smoke-filled rooms were ratified in these larger gatherings. About the turn of the last century, beginning around 1900, 1910, many states began initiating reforms during the so-called progressive era, requiring parties to give members within the state the opportunity to weigh in on who the party nominee should be. So it's been about 110 years that we've seen, of course, first the caucus, and now more exclusively the primary, become the manner by which delegates are won. So that by the time we reach an ordinary convention, there is almost automatically a presumptive nominee with all the delegates in hand, not because party bigwigs gave it to them, because they were won, primary after primary after primary. So conventions have become more predictable in what occurs. Traditionally, large gatherings of party bigwigs and donors and party activists, state after state after state, county after county after county. The party platform is written, and in these platforms, the parties will stake out positions that they're going to run on things like taxes, jobs, wages, national debt, climate change, trade policy, immigration, public education, college education, regulations, the role of religion, entitlements, social issues, healthcare, guns, terrorism, energy. Platforms are party statements regarding what the party stands for. Democratic platforms tend to look at more liberal solutions, government active solutions. Republican platforms tend to rely on private markets and the invisible hand of the marketplace to deal with many of these matters. Very boring stuff, but the platform is written. This time around, of course, one of the most important decisions that's going to be made is who is Joe Biden going to select as his running mate. He early on committed to selecting a female running mate if he were to be the nominee. There is an understanding, maybe an expectation, in light of the George Floyd killing and all of these issues involving police and policing, that Biden might be inclined to select a female running mate of color. Kamala Harris, former Attorney General of the state of California, now a United States Senator. Val Demings, formerly the police chief in Orlando, Florida. Law and Order, a member of the House of Representatives, someone whose stock is rising. So that's something that, of course, remains to be seen. Now, because of the ongoing concerns about COVID-19, it doesn't seem that there are going to be the large, packed crowds of supporters. Already, the Democrats who were going to hold their convention this month in mid-July in Milwaukee pushed theirs back a full month. The Democratic convention will be held from August 17th to August 20th, still in Milwaukee. They'll write the platform. Biden will select a running mate. The Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, I suspect, unlike 4 years ago, will be more completely melded, or at least Bernie Sanders will, onto the Biden ticket. I don't think the acrimony that was there 4 years ago exists quite as much right now, maybe among Bernie supporters. I've got some very angry children who were Bernie supporters that I don't even want to tell you what they say, but these people have to somehow be reconciled with. And we'll see Joe Biden formally introduced as the nominee. We'll hear his running mate give a speech. We probably will hear from Barack Obama, maybe Bill Clinton, maybe not. That's kind of an iffy question. And again, a big pep rally. In the case of the Democrats, however, a lot of this is going to be either on video or from remote locations or utilizing something like Zoom, maybe even recorded types of speeches like the presentation that we are giving now. The Democrats committed to social distancing and wearing masks in Milwaukee. On the other hand, when the Republican convention begins on August 24th, it's going to be really unique because the state of North Carolina could not guarantee that President Trump and notable Republicans would be able to give a speech in an arena where people did not have to wear masks nor maintain social distance. We now know that a lot of the boring mechanical stuff, like the writing of the platform, is going to be done in Charlotte, in North Carolina. The Republicans have contractually agreed to do so. But we know that all of the speeches, all of the rip-roaring, stem-winding presentations are going to take place in Jacksonville, Florida. That is the home of the live portion of the Republican convention. Unless something really funny changes, in Jacksonville, whose mayor, Lenny Curry, is the former leader of the Florida State Republican Party, in Jacksonville, those attending the convention will not have to maintain social distance. They won't have to wear masks, and the president will be able to bask again, like he does in a multi-thousand person gathering, as he makes the case for his reelection, as Vice President Pence, I suspect, tries to excite the crowd. It's kind of a strong word for Mike Pence. Keep the crowd interested, and other notable Republicans come to make statements on behalf of the president. A split convention, again, because of the coronavirus. So next month, we will continue our examination of important issues. Next month, we are going to look, among other things, at healthcare in the United States. What's available, what's not, how other countries do it, and whether or not a country like the United States will ever embrace something more universal, I guess is the word, in providing opportunities for healthcare to our citizens as a matter of right of citizenship, rather than, as for most Americans, as a benefit of the job in which people are working in. And we're going to begin next month our examination of the system we use to elect our president, the Electoral College. Now before we break, I want to wish everybody a happy Independence Day. If it's coming up, if it occurred, I hope everyone had a wonderful and memorable 4th of July. July 4th, 1776, delegates to a Continental Convention agreed to affix their names to a document that has stood the test of time to probably be the greatest piece of political writing, of political theory to come out of the age of enlightenment. And just to show how aspirational this document was, written by men who were imperfect, who were products of their time, nonetheless trying to construct what they believed in their minds was the perfect nature of governance, We know, of course, that the most memorable part of the Declaration contains the following language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We see elections as a way of Americans choosing those who lead them. And we wonder, of course, 240 plus years later, the progress that we've made regarding this ideal that all men are created equal and are able to, on an equal footing, pursue life, liberty, and happiness. If you have a chance to dust off your copy, it's so concise but so powerful. It's easily readable, and again, it's a beautiful piece of writing. Now, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, we know, was Thomas Jefferson. He wrote the first several drafts. Towards the end, probably the most important collaborator that helped Jefferson polish the document was the delegate from Massachusetts, John Adams. We skip forward, of course, and recognize that both Adams and Jefferson would serve in George Washington's first cabinet. Adams, vice president, Jefferson, secretary of state. We know that John Adams would succeed Washington for one term as president, winning the election of 1796. But we know that, having become bitter rivals, Jefferson would defeat Adams in 1800 and then win a second term as president in the election of 1804. Adams the second president, Jefferson the third. By the time they retired from political life, a lot of estrangement, a lot of animosity, political animosity, I suspect, between the two of them. It's known that probably the most important founding mother, if we might use that term, the most important at the time spouse to individuals who played an important role in building the foundation of the United States government was Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams. John Adams had a long, intimate, open communication and collaboration with his wife, who he considered his wisest counsel. So after Adams and Jefferson retired from public life, Abigail Adams began a correspondence with Thomas Jefferson that would cause these two comrades in arms, later adversaries, to once again become very friendly and communicate frequently with each other. And so it was that John Adams, at the age of 90, and Thomas Jefferson, at the age of 83, would die on the same day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day of the Continental Congress agreeing to sign the document authored by Jefferson with a lot of help from John Adams. You talk about a coincidence. John Adams died the afternoon of July 4th, 1826, and his last words were something to the effect of Thomas Jefferson lives, America lives, because Adams didn't know that in Virginia, earlier that day, Thomas Jefferson had passed away. And for whatever it's worth, 5 years later, on July 4th, 1831, our fifth president, James Monroe, died in his home in Virginia. So a little trivia, I guess, as we like to end these. Follow the polls if you like to look at this stuff. Listen to what the candidates are saying. Keep your eyes out for who Biden might be favoring as his running mate. That is going to be a very critical decision. Still keep your distance, still wear your mask, and I am sincerely looking forward to the day where we will once again be able to meet personally, as become our habit, and hopefully we're looking maybe just another month or so before that can occur. So stay safe and have a wonderful rest of the day. Happy Independence Day to you all. Take care.